So first, just tell me about your role. What do you do in this housing initiative and why is the work important?
Yeah, so in this role, I am doing a couple of things. I'm leading the analysis of race and racism for people in homelessness and housing in the state of California, which is where most of our work takes place. And I'm also leading community engagement efforts, which means that I'm helping our researchers partner with community organizations. And I'm also helping us to think about what it means to do authentic research with communities and with communities as our trusted collaborators every step of the way.
And you mentioned that racial justice component of this too, because oftentimes we paint with a broad brush and we just look at the issue of homelessness. But for some people, it's much harder because of their race.
Absolutely. You know, in the study that we just released, the California statewide study of people experiencing homelessness, this was a major finding that homelessness doesn't affect everyone equally, that communities of color are disproportionately vulnerable to being displaced into homelessness, especially Black and Latinx and Indigenous Californians.
And why are people of color more vulnerable?
Well, there's a lot of overlapping reasons, but I'd say that there's a couple of main ones. One, when we look at the history of housing in this country, what we see is that our neighborhoods were actually built through racist covenants between the government and realtors in the form of what we now call redlining. And what that meant was that, especially in urban areas, Black communities were pushed into certain neighborhoods, were barred from entering other neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods where white communities and families got to live were the better neighborhoods, the prettier neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods with the better schools where they could build more wealth. And so, what we see now is that when we look at our neighborhoods today, they're really following a lot of those same lines, right? The neighborhoods look pretty similar. And one of the implications for that is that families of color weren't able to build the kind of intergenerational wealth that other families of other races were able to build.
And yeah, and that definitely is a conversation we have a lot recently because that's one of the big ways to build wealth in a family is just owning a home. So that's one part of that. So, and then later on, we had the freeway system that was built through
Oh,
those
yeah.
neighborhoods. So it was first, you can't live here, so you're going to live here, and then we're going to build right through this neighborhood. So a lot of challenges there. So how do those impacts continue?
Yeah, those impacts are absolutely continuing today. So I think one, maybe it's useful to take a step back and think about what does it actually take to rent a house or to buy a house, right? If you're renting, you need to have good credit. You need to have income that's sometimes two, three, four times what you need to be able to pay in rent. You need to have enough money for first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit. And you often also need to have references who can talk about, who you are as a person. And that's a pretty high bar to be able to rent housing when everybody needs housing. And so then when you think about the fact that Black and Latinx and Indigenous communities are overall going to worse schools because of the way that schools and neighborhoods are linked, which means that they're making less money overall. There's also a gap in income, right, in terms of what we see people of color and white communities and Asian communities making for the same jobs. And being able to save essentially 3 months' rent, that's a lot of money. And so if you don't have wealth built up, and you can imagine one thing goes wrong and suddenly your housing is insecure and you don't have that saved up, what are you going to do? A lot of people end up without housing.
Yeah, and it's a sad cycle, one that just continues and continues and continues, and it's hard to get out of. And so, talking about your work in California, a lot of people associate the issue of homelessness with larger cities. And we've seen different situations in larger cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco. Why it seems like larger cities are more vulnerable.
It's such a good question. Our recent study that I just mentioned wasn't set up to make those distinctions. But what I do want to say is this. Our team spent a year going around the entire state of California, which has urban and rural, coastal, inland, suburban, small, large communities. And what we found overall was that one, there's people experiencing homelessness everywhere. But two, the reasons that they were experiencing homelessness all came down to really the cost of housing and affordable housing. And so, one of the findings that we have from our study is that when we looked at the median household income that people had before they entered homelessness, it was $960 on average across the state in all these different communities. And when you think about, for reference, to rent a one-bedroom apartment across the state of California, it's $1,700. It's much higher in urban areas. And so whether you're living in an urban area or a suburban area, really the main root of homelessness is housing affordability.
People who can't afford housing oftentimes will view new apartment complexes housing as a positive thing for them, but maybe ask yourself the question of, is this affordable for most people? Because that's really what brings the community together and allows them to contribute to the economy. So it really is a complex issue in that sense. So moving forward, what are some things that we need to do as a society, no matter our city size, to really just bring a solution to this problem and bring in affordable housing?
Yes, such a good question again. Well, the first thing is we need to build more housing. We need to build it quickly, and we need to make it as affordable as possible to those who are struggling with being able to afford housing. So that's number one. We need more housing. But I think the second thing is that we need to be able to do it with a racial equity lens in every step of the way. We talked a little bit earlier about historical redlining and historical events, right, that might lead to the disproportionate impact of homelessness on communities of color. But the truth is that racism continues to infiltrate all of our systems today, whether that's explicit or implicit bias that comes in when somebody's trying to rent an apartment to somebody else, right? We see a lot of discrimination that communities of color are still facing, or when it's about trying to put your name on a list for new housing, right? And so if we don't lead with racial equity and with a racial justice lens, then the system will continue to disproportionately impact communities of color.
For sure. And we have to look at every part of things, because if you want to do something, make change, everyone's starting from a different place. So definitely important to keep that in mind when we're doing things for the future. Dr. Ponder, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.